17. That is the number of Japanese soldiers who survived the Battle of Tarawa as American prisoners. Not 17%, not 1 in 17. 17 men out of 4,690 who had defended the island. Every one of them, when they sat across from an American interrogator for the first time, said essentially the same thing. They said, "I thought you were going to kill me." We're going to tell you everything about what that sentence means today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows is hard to sit with. Now, if you're still here, let's start with what was actually in those files, and then we'll get into what it means. This was not supposed to reach the public. The interrogation records from Japanese prisoners of war in the Pacific were classified for years after the war ended. The psychological warfare assessments that the military built from those records were considered sensitive enough to keep out of press accounts. The pattern they documented, the specific, consistent thing that virtually every Japanese prisoner said in the first hours after capture, was analyzed, weaponized, and used in ways that shaped the final year of the Pacific War. Here is what was in those files. The Japanese military in 1941 operated under a code that had been formalized in the Senjinkun, the Field Service Code, issued by War Minister Hideki Tojo in January of that year. The Senjinkun was distributed to every soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army and was meant to be memorized. It covered a range of conduct in combat. On the subject of capture, it was not ambiguous. It said that a soldier who found himself in a situation where capture was imminent must take his own life. Not as a suggestion, as an order. The code stated explicitly that a soldier who allowed himself to be captured alive had disgraced his unit, his family, and the emperor. The shame of capture was presented as worse than death, and death was presented as the correct alternative to capture in every circumstance. The code did not exist in isolation. It was the formal expression of something that had been building in Japanese military culture for decades, a set of values around honor, shame, and the relationship between a soldier's life and his purpose that went back to samurai tradition and had been systematically reinforced by the Meiji and Taisho-era military education system. By the time a Japanese soldier in 1941 received his copy of the Senjinkun, he had already spent years in a culture that told him the same thing the code made official: that his life was less valuable than his honor, that his honor was inseparable from his unit's performance, and that the worst outcome in any engagement was not death, but the kind of survival that brought shame. The training exercises at Japanese military bases made this concrete. Bayonet training was conducted with live prisoners in some documented cases. The practice of killing rather than capturing enemy soldiers was presented as the correct military behavior, not as a violation of any code. If that was what Japanese soldiers did with enemy prisoners, the logic of what enemy soldiers would do with Japanese prisoners was clear and self-reinforcing. Most Japanese soldiers had internalized this code before they ever left Japan. It was reinforced throughout training. It was reinforced by unit culture, by the social pressure of men who expected the same of each other, and by the knowledge that their families at home would bear the social consequences of a soldier's capture. A prisoner of war did not have family who waited for his return. He had family who were expected to mourn him as if he were dead, because the code said he was dead in everything that mattered. The Senjinkun said something else as well. It said something about the enemy. It said that American soldiers specifically did not respect the conventions of warfare, that Americans would torture prisoners, that Americans would mutilate the dead, that Americans were not soldiers in the proper sense, but something closer to what the propaganda called kichiku, demons, beasts. The word was used in official communications, in newspapers, in the letters that soldiers received from home. Kichiku, American and British demons. It was not a metaphor. It was meant as a literal description of what the men on the other side of the line were. This is what the 17 survivors of Tarawa had been trained to believe. This is what every Japanese soldier who was ever captured had been trained to believe. And this is why, without exception, every one of them said the same thing when they realized they were alive. The Battle of Tarawa lasted 76 hours, from November 20th to November 23rd, 1943. The Marines who landed on Basio Island encountered defenses that had been built over 2 years to be as close to impenetrable as Japanese military engineering could make them. The beach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. The seawall caught the Marines at the waterline. The bunkers were built from coconut logs, reinforced concrete, and steel plate that the naval bombardment had not destroyed. The Marines who crossed that beach lost men in numbers that made Tarawa one of the most contested 76 hours in the history of the Corps. The Marines who fought there later said that the resistance they encountered was unlike anything they had been prepared for. Not in the military sense. The training had been adequate. The courage of the Marines was not in question. Unlike in the sense that the men they were fighting did not behave the way soldiers in other theaters behaved. There was no moment of flagging resistance, no point at which units broke and fled and were mopped up afterward. There was resistance until there was no one left to resist. Positions that had been thought neutralized by naval gunfire or grenades turned out to contain men who were still alive and still fighting. The Marines learned, at Tarawa, to treat every fixed position as if it were occupied, until there was physical evidence otherwise. The lesson cost them men to learn. When it was over, 4,690 Japanese defenders were dead. 17 were alive to be taken prisoner. The 17 included men who had been knocked unconscious by shell blasts, men too severely wounded to resist, and one officer who later explained, through an interpreter, that he had been unable to locate his weapon in the darkness when the final Marine assault overran his position and had found himself captured before the moment to choose death had fully arrived. All 17 were processed through the prisoner handling system. All 17 were interrogated. And all 17, independently, in their first hours of contact with Americans, expressed some version of the same thing. They had expected to be killed immediately. The fact that they had not been killed was, for most of them, not reassuring. It was disorienting. It did not fit the information they had been given about what Americans did with prisoners. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. The interrogators who processed Japanese prisoners across the Pacific were often Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans who had volunteered for the military intelligence service specifically because they spoke Japanese. The same men whose families were behind the wire at Manzanar and Topaz were sitting across from Japanese officers and translating the first confused questions. Are you going to execute us now or later? The answer was always the same. You are a prisoner of war. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will not be executed. The cultural knowledge the Nisei interrogators brought to these sessions was not just linguistic. They understood the specific weight of certain words in Japanese military culture. They understood the particular shame that the men across the table from them were experiencing. Shame not just at having been captured, but at being alive to be interrogated. Alive when their comrades were dead. Alive in a situation the Senjinkun had defined as having no honorable outcome. The interrogators who wrote about this work later described the challenge of conducting intelligence interviews with men who had not yet decided whether their own survival was legitimate. Men in that state were not strategic about what they said. They were, in some ways, the opposite of strategic. They were simply confused, and from that confusion, genuine information came. Most prisoners did not believe this immediately. The belief structure that the Senjinkun had installed was not undone by a single assurance from an enemy interpreter. What undid it, over hours and days, was the accumulation of evidence that the assurance was true. Medical care for wounds. Food, often better food than the prisoners had eaten in months, given the supply difficulties Japanese forces in the Pacific experienced as the war progressed. A cigarette, a cup of water, the absence of violence. The ordinary human treatment of men who had been trained to expect something entirely different. The shift, when it happened, tended to happen fast. The intelligence officers who processed prisoners noted in their reports that the psychological state of a Japanese prisoner in the first 6 to 12 hours was characterized primarily by confusion, not trauma in the expected sense, but a specific cognitive disorientation that came from encountering a reality that did not match the model. After that initial period, the confusion often gave way to something closer to relief, and in some cases, to a willingness to cooperate with interrogators that surprised American officers who had expected resistance. The cooperation was not universal. Some prisoners maintained silence. Some remained genuinely committed to the emperor and to the idea that capture was a permanent disgrace. But many did not. Many talked. And the reason they talked, the interrogators concluded, was that the propaganda had broken. When the model breaks, the men who were inside it have no replacement. The Senjinkun had told them what Americans were, and Americans were not that. If the code had been wrong about the kichiku, what else had it been wrong about? Some prisoners said, in debriefings conducted later, that the moment they understood they were not going to be killed was the moment the entire edifice of what they had been told began to come apart. Not the military code, not the honor they felt for their dead comrades, something more fundamental, the assumption that the information they had been given was reliable. The American military understood what this meant. The interrogation summaries from across the Pacific Theater were analyzed by the psychological warfare units that operated under the Joint Chiefs. The summaries all pointed to the same thing. The Japanese military had created a belief system so complete and so uniformly distributed that its failure in individual cases produced men who were psychologically unmoored in ways that made them more cooperative than any other prisoner population American forces had encountered. German prisoners were often resistant, calculating, trained in how to behave under interrogation. Japanese prisoners, once they had accepted that the expected execution was not coming, often had no framework left for what to do. The psychological warfare units built from this. The program was called the Pacific Psychological Warfare Branch, and it operated under the Office of War Information in coordination with the military. The men who designed the leaflets understood the specific problem they were working against. A general message, surrender and live, was not enough. The prohibition against surrender was too deeply embedded. What was needed was something that addressed the specific belief the Senjinkun had installed, that Americans killed prisoners. The only argument against a belief that specific was evidence that specific. Beginning in 1944, American aircraft dropped leaflets over Japanese-held islands that included statements from prisoners. Not invented statements, actual testimony, translated into Japanese, from men who had been captured and were alive and were being fed. The leaflets described what capture actually looked like, in the words of men who had experienced it. They included the prisoner's name and unit. In some cases, they included a photograph. The strategic logic was simple. If the entire resistance to capture was built on the belief that capture meant death, then proof that capture did not mean death was the only argument that could work. The results were documented and debated. Surrender rates among Japanese forces increased in 1944 and 1945, compared to earlier in the war, though they remained extraordinarily low by any comparison with European theaters. At Saipan in 1944, approximately 921 Japanese soldiers and civilians were taken prisoner, out of a defending force estimated at 29,000. At Okinawa in 1945, roughly 10,755 Japanese prisoners were taken, the largest number of any Pacific battle, but still a fraction of the total force. The leaflets did not produce mass surrender. The cultural and military prohibition against surrender was too deep for that. But the marginal effect was real, and the military analyzed it carefully. Because in a war of the scale the Pacific had become, even marginal effects on enemy willingness to fight to the death had consequences measured in American casualties. A prisoner taken at Peleliu in September 1944, one of roughly 202 Japanese prisoners captured in a battle that killed approximately 10,695 Japanese defenders, described his capture in a debriefing that was transcribed and filed and eventually declassified in the 1970s. He said he had been buried under rubble when his position was overrun. When he regained consciousness, American Marines were standing over him. His first thought, he said, was to find a weapon. There was no weapon within reach. His second thought was to provoke the Marines into shooting him, which he believed was the correct outcome given the situation. He looked up at the nearest Marine and prepared himself. The Marine looked back at him and called for a medic. He said he did not understand what was happening for several minutes. He said the confusion was so complete that he could not form a coherent thought about what to do next, because every decision tree he had was built on the assumption that this moment would not occur. He was alive. A Marine medic was putting a bandage on his arm. Nothing in his training had prepared him for what to feel about this. There is a specific detail from the Okinawa interrogation records that does not appear in most accounts of the battle. A number of prisoners taken in the final weeks of the Okinawa campaign said, when asked why they had surrendered, that they had seen or received a leaflet with testimony from a prisoner, that they had believed the testimony, that the belief had reached a threshold where, in a specific moment under specific circumstances, it had been sufficient to override the Senjinkun. The interrogators who documented these accounts noted that none of the men who gave this explanation appeared to have made the decision easily. All of them described it as the most difficult thing they had ever done. Several of them cried during the debriefing, not from relief, from the specific grief of men who had violated something they had been trained from childhood to treat as sacred. What the interrogation records show, taken together, is something that the formal military histories of the Pacific War have been slow to incorporate into their accounts. The records show that the enemy the United States was fighting was not monolithic. Behind the uniform consistency of the first words spoken in every interrogation room, the words about expected execution, about the anticipated death, were individual men who had been shaped by a specific system and who, when that system's central claim proved false, were as capable of reconsidering their situation as any human being exposed to evidence that contradicts what they have been told. Not all of them reconsidered. Many went to their deaths having never encountered an American face-to-face. Many more encountered one and still chose to die. The cultural prohibition was real, and it was deep, and the leaflets and the interrogation rooms and the prisoner testimony only eroded it at the margins. But the margins mattered. And the consistency of what was said at those margins, the specific sentence, repeated in a dozen languages in a dozen interrogation rooms across the Pacific over 4 years of war, revealed something that the military psychologists noted carefully, and that the historians are still working to fully understand. The men who processed these prisoners, the Nisei interrogators, the psychological warfare officers, the military intelligence analysts who compiled the summaries, carried the pattern they had documented for the rest of their lives. It appeared in memoirs. It appeared in the histories that were finally written when the records were declassified. It appeared in the accounts that veterans gave in interviews conducted in the 1970s and 1980s, when historians were finally asking the questions. The historian John Dower, who spent decades analyzing the Pacific War from both sides, described the prisoner testimony pattern in his 1986 book, War Without Mercy, as one of the most revealing documents of the conflict, not for what it said about American behavior, which was neither uniformly humane nor uniformly brutal, but for what it said about the completeness of Japanese military indoctrination. The fact that every prisoner, regardless of rank, regardless of education, regardless of the specific island or battle where he had been captured, said the same thing meant that the message had been delivered universally and received uniformly. There was no variance. A private from Kyushu and an officer from Tokyo arrived at the interrogation table with the same expectation. The system that produced that uniformity was, in its own terrible way, impressive. What they all said consistently was this: the Japanese soldier they had interrogated was not the enemy the propaganda on both sides had described. He was a man who had been given a complete and false picture of the world, and had done what men do with complete and false pictures. He had acted on it, fully and without reservation, until the moment the picture broke against the reality. And the moment it broke, he was, in some fundamental sense, alone in a way that was very difficult to describe and very easy to understand. The records were declassified in stages, some in the 1960s, more in the 1970s, the rest across the decades that followed, as various government agencies worked through their backlogs. The full picture did not exist in any single archive. Researchers had to cross-reference interrogation files from multiple theaters, psychological warfare assessments from different commands, and the memoirs of the Nisei interrogators who wrote about what they had seen in the rooms. When the picture came together, it was consistent with what the men who had been there had been saying informally for years, that the single most reliable thing about a Japanese prisoner was the first thing he said, that the uniformity of that first sentence revealed the uniformity of the system that had produced him, and that the moment the system's central lie broke, in the specific hours after capture, when a man understood he was not going to be killed, something opened up that no one had designed for and no one had quite anticipated. They remember the interrogation rooms, the bare tables, the interpreters, the specific silence that fell when a prisoner finally understood that the question was not a trick. They remember the faces of men who had prepared themselves to die and were trying to understand, hour by hour, what it meant that they had not. They remember the particular look that came over those faces when the belief finally shifted. Not relief, not happiness, something quieter and harder to name. Now you know what was in the file. Did your grandfather serve in the Pacific? Tell us his name in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.